So here we are again for the 5th installment of our Be the Change Challenge. And I have to admit that at the beginning of the year, when I said, oh, I know what we'll do the 7 principles, we'll add the 8th principle, I thought I was setting myself up for a very easy slate of services. This week has proven itself, and I've been thinking about this for several weeks. This particular principle, our 5th principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. That's been a challenge for me to say, how do we live that principle every day? And the first thing I had to do was come up with some understanding of really what is consciousness. And most of what we observe in the natural law in the world is through the scientific process. You know, the scientific process involves observation. Someone would say, at 7 a.m., I went out and I looked through the telescope and it was pointed in XYZ direction, and this is what I observed. So everything that we have in the natural law works that way, but then we come back to ourselves, man, woman, people. And there's a part of us that is not observable. It's the part that's inside of ourselves. It's the voice that's in our head. You can say, oh, I saw Tim walk down the street, pick up the bucket, pour the bucket out. And you can give no explanation as to why Tim did it, what Tim was thinking, if he thought good thing or bad thing. And that brings me to my problem with consciousness, because it's not very observable. We have our intellect, and that makes us rational beings, allows us to know, to judge, to choose what's good, what's bad. And it's in that space of judgment that our consciousness comes into play, because in our consciousness, it begins to tell us if what we did was a good thing or a bad thing. And another way our consciousness, it tends to act as though it were a compass. And so I went to the Oxford Dictionary. And in the Oxford Dictionary, it defined conscious as a sense of consciousness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of one's own conduct, intentions, or character, together with a feeling of obligation to do right or to be good. And once I read that, it was all settled. I figured it all out. It was easy and simple. I'll read it again. It's a lot. A sense of consciousness of the moral goodness or blameworthiness of one's own conduct, intentions, or character, together with the feeling of obligation to do right or be good. So, in other words, our consciousness is an inner voice that acts like a compass. And so, apparently, all of us have it. It's built into the system. But what happens if your compass doesn't point to true north? If your compass doesn't point to true north, you may not get to the desired destination that you were trying to go if you were using it for directions purposes. And in the sense of our lives and our journey, our conscience, if it's not pointed to true north, we may end up with an inactive conscience, because our conscience, it works very much like a muscle. It has to be exercised, and through things like fights, bad habits, and just a complete ignoring of the conscience, it can become corrupted, and we can then lack conscience. But what we do here on a weekly basis is this is like a dojo of consciousness in some ways. In some ways, we come in, because consciousness is very much personal and an inside job, but we come into community together, right? We allow conversation and communication to take place, and that helps to form and keep our consciousness focused to true north, and getting ready for our time together and trying to figure out how to weave Father's Day, Juneteenth, and the 5th principle into this one moment of time with you. I thought about
when I was a child, because there's so many things in the way that we are raised that are intended to help hone our sense of
our consciousness, our parents and our structures as children. When we go to school, a lot of things they are intended to teach us right from wrong, to help us become better and more capable parts of society. But then we get to a point in life when there is no more parents every day and there is no more school. And that's this no, because June, as you guys remember from last year, Juneteenth is a celebration of the last enslaved people in the United States to get their freedom, right? It happened in Texas, and it was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so what I postulate is that the conscience
of all of those people in Texas
was not pointing to true north at that time, right? And then when we look at our society today, we see all kinds of examples where it seems that the conscience of the people that are exhibiting or carrying out certain behaviors and certain activities in our society and communities, it seems they're not pointing to true north either. So what is our responsibility as Unitarian Universalists, and how do we take this challenge that we've given ourselves this year to be the change by living principles? How do we do that? So the first thing that I think about is, as a child, I have to give thanks to my parents, because every week my brother would have family meetings. And he had an agenda every week for that family meeting. And I didn't know what he was doing then, but he was helping to hone my conscience. And he was helping to hone both my analytical skills as well. He would ask us questions. Earlier, he said that the board is faced with a quandary. What color are we going to paint the outside of the building now that we're going to paint the outside of the building? So as an example, when I was a child in our family meeting, my father would come to us and say, we have to paint the house. And he would ask the kids what color they wanted to paint the house and allow us to make and articulate an argument as to why it should be that color. I don't think anything we ever said mattered and was ever followed through with, because it wasn't a true democracy. However, that repetitive weekly exercise that my father crafted for us today gives me a muscle in the sense of a character compass that helps me point it forward. It's the muscle that basically allowed me to follow Tom. I always talk about following Tom into this building, but I followed Tom into this building because of that muscle. I was on a quest for to practice and refine my skills. So there's two parts. And this is the challenge with this principle. There's two parts to this principle. There's character, and then there's this use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. Use of the democratic process. And so one of the things that I learned when I first came into this building, mostly because of Pam Flodman, but because of others, there was always a rigorous academic background given to points and things that were brought up. And so the whole word conscious comes from the Latin conscientia, and that's knowledge within self. And then I said, so now I know where the consciousness comes from. It comes from Latin, knowledge within self. And then we go back to democracy, which is the second part of the principle. And the best that I can determine is democracy came from Athens, right? The democracy came from Greece, and in ancient Greece, the model that we're building on is extremely flawed. It's flawed in that the only people that could participate in the democracy of ancient Greece were men who owned property. That was the model that was drawn upon in part by the founding fathers, but women, children, slaves in ancient Greece were all property. So now we have a 21st century Unitarian principle that's founded in a very flawed model.
And then that model has evolved over several different societies, and it's come to the United States, where we get our Constitution of Founding Fathers. And we all know that at the inception of this country, when the powers that be decided to make some rules, the only people that could participate then were white property owners. So the model of democracy itself is flawed. And that's why I think they're sandwiched together. And one, there was lots of interesting videos. I've listened to several different Unitarian congregations talk about the fifth principle. And one of them, they went to the comments in the audience. I promised Pamela I was going to try not to do so that we don't have to have the challenge of running the iPad around. But they asked people about democracy and how it works. And one of the comments that the audience member said is it's one of two things. It's either a tyranny of the majority, where the majority forces their thing down the minority's throat, or it's a tyranny of the minority, whereby in a 100% everybody has to vote the same way, one single vote, one single person can hold everything back. That's not exactly in the model of democracy that we use a majority rule, but in that it still falls. And so now we come back to consciousness and conscience, our own internal conscience, our own internal values. Then in the community, in the context of the fellowship, we have a very, very recent gist of last week of our congregational meeting where we engaged in the democratic process. We voted on our budget for the next year. We voted on our board for the next year. We may have done something else, I don't know, but we came together, we had a discussion, and we voted. And then it reminds me of last year where we had a more contentious situation that just involved how we were going to handle the functioning of the building as it relates to the security of the building. And we had lots of different opinions from different individuals of how that should be, and that's when the democratic process starts to come into play, but also the sharing of information, right? The sharing of why something happened or why somebody thinks the way that they do. And that brings us back to this space and this place. And so one of the sources that I found in getting ready to visit with you guys today was Reverend Craig Morrow, who's a UU minister up at the UU congregation. And in his comments and his thoughts, he postulated that the 7 principles cannot be taken in isolation because they weren't meant to work alone. And he also said that they had to be taken in the order that they are written because they build upon one another. And I started to think about that. I'm going to invite you, if you have your program, you can turn it over. The principles are there. The first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And that principle just basically lays it out. We have to see that all people have value. And I had a professor named Tony Alfieri in law school, and when we had all or shall, he would put a lot of emphasis on the word. So he would say, all people, only for us to recognize that all means all. There's nothing else except for all. And our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, kind of gives some direction to the first principle. First, we have to see that all people are people. And then we are instructed to interact with justice, equity, and compassion. The third principle, acceptance of one another and encouragement of spiritual growth, brings us back to our dojo. Every week we come in and we do 1 and 2. And in that we go into number 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. In that spiritual growth, we're looking for truth and meaning in this journey of life beyond just the observable natural law. And then that brings us to 5, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process. And what I think is happening there for us is 3 things. 1, it allows us through our conscience It allows us to figure out how we govern ourselves as UUs, as individuals. And then, like our gathering music said, as our centering thought, by working on ourselves, by doing that mental work, Michael Jackson, man in the mirror, it allows us to start to influence our friends, our family, our coworkers, and our associates that we are around. And that begins to make a change in the world. And the third reason this is so important is that as members of a UU congregation, we have affirmed and promoted that we were going to do this to begin with. So when you leave your space every morning, wherever that is, and go out into the world, this is what I'm going to challenge you to do. I'm going to challenge you to have a principle in your pocket. 1 to 7. But every day when you leave your space, you have to have a conscious intention of acknowledging that all people have value. And the person that said this in one of the videos, it was a really challenging statement, but he said, all people, so he started to say names, Hitler. And it's like, oh man, that's a challenge. Well, back to 20 out here. Oh! Donald Trump. Oh! The inherent worth and dignity of all people. And that requires to do that work on a daily basis. And then it's not in the congregation and into the greater community. And one person, one vote. We have different challenges in the way that our society is structured right now. Our Supreme Court says that a corporation is the equivalent of a person as it comes to our election process and donations. So one person, one vote is not an exact equivalent. But that Supreme Court decision could potentially be overturned by people by simply making a change to the Constitution. Liberty and justice for all by the people. And the only way that comes about is for us to, 1, govern ourselves, 2, become positive influences in our community. And remember that we have learned and promoted to do that as we moving forward. So, you go out and leave your spaces this week, have a principle in your pocket, and as Starr to the piano and begins to get us ready for our closing song, which is one of my favorite songs. I'm going to take us to the last principles which are coming up. Where did we go? There we go. The goal of world community is peace, liberty, and justice for all. Several UUs that I've heard said that when Jesus referred to the kingdom of heaven, he wasn't speaking of a necessary afterlife in another place. He was referring to a world, a blessed community where there was plenty and everybody had according to their need. And there was peace, liberty, and justice for all. And that is what each of us are working and building towards. And then the last thing that came into our UU pantheon of belief is the respect for the interdependent web, because there's more than just us, there's an environment and the whole world of Mother Nature out there. So as we go into the summer and people go all across the world to Nicaragua and everywhere else, we're going to go, I'm going to Pittsburgh. Keep that in mind. Keep your principles in your pocket and live those principles every day. And my favorite song that we sing here is Blue Boat Home. So